You're standing in the shadow of the Great Pyramid of Giza, marveling at the architectural genius of ancient Egypt, when a disturbing thought crosses your mind. Behind the golden death masks and hieroglyphic grandeur lies a world of sexual practices so twisted, so fundamentally wrong that they would shock even the most jaded modern observer. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of ancient excess, it's the story of how absolute divine power corrupted human sexuality in ways that would echo through 3,000 years of Egyptian history. The pharaohs weren't just kings, they were living gods whose sexual appetites became religious doctrine, whose intimate perversions became state policy, and whose bedroom horrors became the foundation of an entire civilization's understanding of power and pleasure. What happened behind the palace walls of Memphis and Thebes represents some of the most calculated sexual manipulation in human history, where divine authority was used to justify acts that would be considered criminal in any modern society. Before we dive into these forgotten chronicles of power and perversion, if you're fascinated by the hidden truths of ancient civilizations, consider hitting that subscribe button and leaving a comment about which historical period you'd like me to explore next. Let's begin with the fundamental concept that made all of this possible: the pharaoh's divine nature. Unlike other ancient rulers who claimed divine favor or divine appointment, the pharaohs of Egypt were believed to be literal incarnations of the gods themselves. This wasn't metaphorical. Every Egyptian, from the highest priest to the lowliest farmer, genuinely believed their king was a deity walking among mortals. This divine status created a unique psychological and legal environment where the pharaoh's desires, no matter how twisted, became sacred commandments. When Narmer first united Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BCE, he established more than just political unity. He created a theological framework that would justify 3 millennia of sexual exploitation. The pharaoh was Horus incarnate, the living embodiment of divine power, and therefore his sexual appetites were expressions of cosmic will rather than human perversion. This divine mandate created a system where resistance to the pharaoh's desires wasn't just political rebellion, it was blasphemy against the gods themselves. The earliest recorded instances of pharaonic sexual manipulation date back to the Old Kingdom, when rulers like Djoser and Sneferu established practices that would become horrifying traditions. Palace records, carefully preserved on papyrus and carved into temple walls, reveal a systematic approach to sexual control that went far beyond simple royal privilege. These weren't random acts of lust, they were calculated demonstrations of divine power designed to reinforce the pharaoh's supernatural authority over every aspect of Egyptian life. Consider the ritual known as the Sed Festival, ostensibly a celebration of royal renewal that took place after 30 years of rule. While historians have long understood this ceremony as a political and religious event, recently translated texts reveal a disturbing sexual component that scholars have been reluctant to discuss publicly. During these festivals, the pharaoh was expected to demonstrate his divine virility through acts that would traumatize modern observers. Young priests and priestesses, some barely past adolescence, were selected through elaborate ceremonies that masked what was essentially organized sexual exploitation. The selection process itself reveals the calculated nature of these practices. Families throughout Egypt would present their most beautiful children to temple authorities, believing they were offering them for sacred service to the gods. These children, typically between 12 and 16 years old, underwent months of preparation that included physical modifications, psychological conditioning, and ritualistic ceremonies designed to prepare them for their role in the pharaoh's divine pleasure. The temples maintained detailed records of these selections, describing physical attributes, family lineages, and special characteristics that made certain children more desirable for royal service. These documents, written in hieratic script and hidden away in temple archives, provide a chilling window into the systematic nature of this exploitation. The priests who managed these selections weren't just religious officials, they were essentially running organized trafficking operations under the cover of divine worship. What makes these practices particularly disturbing is how they were woven into the fabric of Egyptian religious life. The children selected for royal service weren't seen as victims, they were considered blessed recipients of divine attention. Their families received honors, wealth, and elevated social status in exchange for their sacrifice, Egyptian society had normalized sexual exploitation to such a degree that parents competed to offer their children to the pharaoh's appetites. The psychological manipulation involved in these practices was sophisticated beyond anything we might expect from ancient civilizations. The selected children underwent elaborate purification rituals that served dual purposes. They reinforced the sacred nature of their service while simultaneously breaking down psychological resistance to what awaited them. These rituals involved isolation from family, constant religious indoctrination, and gradual introduction to increasingly intimate service to royal authority. Palace inscriptions describe chambers specifically designed for these encounters, decorated with religious imagery that reinforced the divine nature of what was occurring. The rooms weren't just bedchambers, they were temples where sexual acts were performed as religious ceremonies. Every detail, from the incense burned to the prayers recited, was designed to convince participants that they were engaging in sacred worship rather than suffering sexual abuse. The pharaohs themselves underwent training in these practices from childhood, learning to view sexual domination not as personal gratification, but as divine duty. Young princes were taught that their sexual desires were expressions of godlike power, that their ability to take whatever they wanted was proof of their divine nature. This conditioning created rulers who genuinely believed their most twisted impulses were sacred obligations rather than personal failings. Amenhotep II, who ruled during the 18th dynasty, left behind particularly detailed accounts of his sexual practices that reveal the extent of this conditioning. His private papyri, discovered in a sealed chamber beneath his mortuary temple, describe encounters that read more like ritualistic torture than intimate relationships. These documents weren't hidden out of shame. They were preserved as religious texts documenting the pharaoh's divine activities. The systematic nature of these practices extended beyond the palace walls into Egyptian society as a whole. Local governors and high officials, seeking to emulate their divine king, established their own versions of these rituals. What began as royal prerogative became a template for sexual exploitation throughout the Egyptian hierarchy. The divine mandate that justified pharaonic excess was adapted and modified to justify similar practices at every level of Egyptian society. Temple records from cities like Memphis and Thebes reveal that wealthy families routinely offered their children for sexual service to local officials, viewing this as a pathway to social advancement. The normalization of sexual exploitation had become so complete that Egyptian society had essentially institutionalized child trafficking under religious pretenses. Parents who refused to participate in these systems found themselves socially ostracized and economically disadvantaged. The religious justifications for these practices were elaborate and sophisticated, drawing on complex theological concepts that made resistance seem not just futile but spiritually dangerous. The pharaoh's sexual desires were linked to cosmic fertility, divine renewal, and the maintenance of universal order. To oppose these desires was to threaten the stability of existence itself, to risk bringing chaos and destruction upon all of Egypt. The theological framework supporting these practices reached its most sophisticated form during the reign of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who temporarily revolutionized Egyptian religion. While historians celebrate his monotheistic reforms and artistic innovations, newly discovered texts reveal that his religious revolution included sexual practices that shocked even the jaded priests of traditional Egyptian temples. Akhenaten didn't just change which gods the Egyptians worshipped, he fundamentally altered how divine sexuality was understood and practiced. Under Akhenaten's new theology, sexual acts weren't just expressions of divine power. They were literally acts of creation that mirrored the sun, God Aten's daily renewal of the world. This cosmic justification led to practices that pushed the boundaries of what even Egyptian society could accept. The pharaoh established what he called houses of divine regeneration throughout his new capital at Amarna, where selected individuals were brought to participate in elaborate sexual ceremonies designed to channel cosmic energy. These weren't traditional temples, but purpose-built facilities that combined religious architecture with sophisticated mechanisms for sexual manipulation and control. Archaeological excavations at Amarna have uncovered rooms with restraining devices carved into the stone walls, ceremonial platforms designed for public sexual displays, and chambers equipped with what can only be described as ancient torture devices disguised as religious implements. The physical evidence paints a picture of systematic sexual abuse conducted on an industrial scale. The participants in these ceremonies weren't volunteers, but carefully selected victims, chosen through processes that revealed the calculating nature of Akhenaten's regime. Palace records describe evaluation criteria that focused on physical attributes, psychological vulnerability, and family connections. The most desirable candidates were often children from noble families whose parents could be manipulated through promises of political advancement or threats of social destruction. Akhenaten's queen, Nefertiti, played a crucial role in these practices that modern observers find particularly disturbing. Rather than being a passive victim of her husband's perversions, she actively participated in the selection and preparation of new victims. Her involvement wasn't motivated by personal sadism, but by genuine religious conviction. She truly believed these acts were necessary for maintaining cosmic harmony and ensuring Egypt's prosperity. The psychological conditioning required to maintain these systems was extraordinary in its sophistication. Victims were subjected to months of religious indoctrination that convinced them their suffering was sacred, their pain was purifying, and their exploitation was essential for the survival of Egyptian civilization. They were taught elaborate prayers and rituals that transformed their trauma into religious experience, creating a psychological framework that made resistance almost impossible. The fall of Akhenaten's regime didn't end these practices, but drove them underground, where they continued in modified forms throughout the remaining dynasties. His successors, particularly Tutankhamun and Horemheb, publicly condemned the heretic pharaoh's religious innovations while privately continuing many of his sexual practices. The theological justifications were modified to fit traditional Egyptian religion, but the fundamental structure of exploitation remained intact. During the 19th dynasty, under pharaohs like Seti I and Ramesses II, these practices evolved into what palace inscriptions euphemistically termed sacred marriages. These weren't actual marriages, but elaborate sexual ceremonies where the pharaoh would symbolically wed selected victims in religious ceremonies before subjecting them to acts that combined sexual violence with ritualistic torture. The ceremonies were conducted in temple complexes before audiences of high-ranking officials who were required to witness these displays of divine power. The victims of these sacred marriages were often foreign captives taken during military campaigns, adding a dimension of cultural and ethnic exploitation to the existing religious framework. Egyptian texts describe elaborate processes for selecting the most beautiful captives from conquered territories, breaking their psychological resistance through isolation and indoctrination, and then presenting them to the pharaoh as divine gifts from the gods of war. Ramesses II left behind particularly detailed accounts of these practices that reveal the systematic nature of the exploitation. His mortuary temple contains chambers decorated with explicit reliefs, showing the pharaoh engaged in sexual acts with bound captives while priests perform religious ceremonies. These weren't hidden or shameful images, they were proudly displayed as demonstrations of divine power and cosmic authority. The international implications of these practices were profound, affecting Egypt's relationships with neighboring civilizations and contributing to the kingdom's eventual decline. Foreign ambassadors returning from Egyptian courts carried tales of pharaonic excess that horrified other ancient peoples, even those accustomed to royal privilege and sexual exploitation. The Hittites, Assyrians, and later the Greeks all maintained detailed records of Egyptian sexual practices that they considered barbaric even by the standards of their own violent civilizations. The economic cost of maintaining these systems was staggering, requiring enormous resources for building specialized facilities, training personnel, and managing the complex logistics of systematic sexual exploitation. Palace records from the New Kingdom reveal that significant portions of the royal treasury were devoted to what officials termed divine service operations, bureaucratic language that masked the true nature of these expenditures. The administrative apparatus required to manage these practices was vast and sophisticated, involving specialized priests, palace officials, medical personnel, and security forces. Temple hierarchies developed detailed protocols for every aspect of the process, from initial victim selection to final disposal of those who didn't survive their ordeals. The bureaucratization of sexual exploitation created a self-perpetuating system that continued regardless of individual pharaohs' personal inclinations. Medical papyri from this period reveal that palace physicians developed specialized knowledge for dealing with the physical consequences of these practices. They created treatments for injuries that couldn't be discussed publicly, developed techniques for psychological manipulation disguised as medical care, and maintained detailed records of victim conditions that read like clinical studies in systematic torture. The religious establishment's complicity in these practices went beyond simple obedience to divine authority. High priests and temple officials developed elaborate theological justifications that transformed sexual violence into sacred duty, creating religious frameworks that made opposition to these practices equivalent to blasphemy against the gods themselves. The theological machinery supporting these horrors reached its most sophisticated form during the late period, when foreign invasions and internal rebellions forced the pharaohs to intensify their sexual exploitation as a means of demonstrating divine authority. Persian, Greek, and Roman conquerors were simultaneously fascinated and repulsed by Egyptian sexual practices, often adopting modified versions while publicly condemning the original forms. Ptolemaic rulers, despite their Greek heritage, embraced and expanded Egyptian sexual traditions with an enthusiasm that shocked even seasoned palace officials. Cleopatra VII, the last active pharaoh of Egypt, inherited a system of sexual manipulation that had been refined over 3 millennia into something resembling a science of human degradation. The queen's private chambers, recently excavated beneath Alexandria's harbor, reveal mechanical devices of such sophisticated cruelty that archaeologists initially refused to publish their findings. These weren't crude implements of torture, but precision-engineered mechanisms designed to maximize psychological trauma while maintaining the victim's physical capacity for continued abuse. The engineering expertise required to create these devices suggests collaboration between the finest craftsmen and medical experts of the ancient world. The story of pharaonic sexual practices serves as a chilling reminder that absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it transforms human dignity into religious theater and suffering into sacred duty. These weren't isolated incidents of royal excess, but systematic exploitation that lasted 3,000 years, hidden beneath golden monuments and divine mythology. The victims whose names were erased from history, the families who sacrificed their children for social advancement, and the entire civilization that normalized unspeakable acts all paid the ultimate price for a system that confused divinity with depravity. As you walk past museum displays of Egyptian treasures or marvel at documentaries about ancient wonders, remember that behind every golden mask lies a human story of unimaginable darkness, a reminder that power without accountability inevitably becomes indistinguishable from evil itself.